Welcome to Do What Matters Most. This is episode 2 in the series, Uniting. The lack of unity among people and institutions often limits the experience and performance of those involved because valuable time is spent addressing the problems of divisiveness rather than focusing on their work or purpose. As it turns out, uniting well also produces many positive benefits, which can be seen when schools and parents unite themselves. In this episode, learn about these benefits and examples of how they were achieved by people who had the courage to unite. Visit mattersmostmedia.org to find more about the podcast and other resources.
This is the second in a series having to do with uniting. And I remind you that the reason I'm doing this series is because I have seen in many places in my life where the disunity between family members or between social institutions or between governments almost always has created something that is not positive. I want to compare this with the idea that some individuals are overly dependent, and so therefore it's nice for each party or parties to have a sense of autonomy. And then as it turns out, the people who have autonomy, which is a healthy form of behavior, almost always crave intimacy. So it turns out that they do both. They like autonomy and they like, say, the cooperative effort or intimate contact if they're people in relationships. The last podcast, I told a story about a girls' softball game. And in this game, a player hit a home run. And when rounding first base, hit the base incorrectly and severely sprained her ankle. Without a word, the first and second baseman rushed to her, helped her up, and then helped her finish all of the bases, which is the privilege of someone who gets a great hit. I didn't tell you that before this happened, there was usually snippiness, snarky comments to the umpires, criticism of the other forms of tension. And then what happened after the girls helped the home run hitter, it ended all of that. For some reason, people's behavior changed. They were more cooperative. They were less angry, frustrated, or tense. Now, this raises an interesting question of what happens when there is unity. Is it just good feelings? Do people feel better, and that's why we should do it? It might seem that way until you learn that unity studies, sometimes called cooperation studies, almost always show improved performance for everybody who participates in it. Mental health, and better organization. A long line of research about cooperation in schools demonstrates that the schools that do this more than they compete tend to have children who perform better academically. Now we know that divisiveness tends to limit the performance of those who participate in it, but please note this is not the same thing as competition. Disunity means that people do not only not cooperate, they, in fact, might be willing to harm others or demean or smear others because disunity means that we don't know others well and we tend to deride rather than cooperate. And what this practically means is that all the other forms of dismissal or insulting behavior or something are appropriate when there is disunity. This division clearly illustrates that when there is disunity, then something or someone will not be as effective. Now, in this podcast, I want to share with you about the benefits of uniting schools and families. This is a hot national topic, apparently, because in the last few years, we've had evidence that some political leaders believe that parents have no place in the educating of their children. In fact, the candidate for the governor position in Virginia said that out loud. Parents should not be involved in selecting the curriculum for our children. Conflict involving the FBI as a result occurred because some people thought angry parents might be domestic terrorists. Well, I would say that it's about time for parents to take a greater interest in what happens in their schools, but not only because the schools might be teaching something that parents don't want or like. It is because that the cooperation of parents and the teachers in the classrooms and the organization of the school actually and dramatically can improve the children's experience. Children's performance is lower in their experience at school and is less positive when parents are relatively uninvolved. And then you can ask teachers, which I've done on several occasions, to identify what percent of parents come to parent night to talk over their children. Most do not. And what's interesting is those who do tend to become, because this is a visible problem that's been presented by the school to the parents, which actually results in reducing the morale parents have for the schools typically. Now, let me give you an extreme example of a disunity and the consequences of that. On one occasion, as a consultant and trainers for educators, I was in a school and the school principal told me about this experience. It turns out that recently in the afternoon, the toilets in the boys' bathroom overflowed. And they overflowed, according to the janitor, because someone had stuffed paper into the toilets, plugged them up, and then flushed the toilets, and that's where the water came from. A little bit of investigation discovered that a second grade boy had been the culprit. So the school administrators decided that this boy should do something to help clean up the mess and apologize and do something and so forth. Well, the very next morning, the parents of this boy was in the school, having heard from the boy what the school made him do, and they were threatening to sue the school principal. Rather than saying, we're sorry for what our child did, is there anything we can do to help? See, they were ready to engage in legal conflict because of the division psychologically between them and the school was so great. Now, not only is children's performance lower in their experience at school and is less positive when parents are uninvolved, what happens is that this miscommunication often leads to certain kinds of trouble. In this case, the threat of a lawsuit and the lack of participation of parents in the school and loyalty to it related to experiences or conflict over what in the curriculum and negative attitudes about what parents and why parents think and how the administration thinks. So one time, on an occasion when I was teaching a group of parents whose children were low performers, they were poor readers in junior high and high school. And I was pointing out that parents' attitudes towards school often is transmitted to children, and it might be good for the parents to examine theirs. So here's what I did. I asked the parents to identify positive experiences they had had in their own school experience. No one responded. And after several seconds, no one responded again. And finally, one woman, probably out of sympathy for me, said, I have had an experience I'd be happy to share. Here's her experience. She said that when she was in the 4th grade, she fell on the ice, slipped on the ice, and hurt her head, and the school nurse was very nice to her. And I thought, wow, if that's an example of her good experiences, you could understand why maybe she was somewhat distant from the school. Now, I'm not saying that this is the school's fault, and I'm not saying it's the parents' fault. I am saying, however, that in our society, we do not have enough emphasis on the importance of uniting, the idea of being together and working out something which actually makes it work. And sometimes that emphasis is also lacking in our families, inside our business organizations, and inside our churches, as a matter of fact. So you could read any survey about what's happening in the mainline churches in the United States, and they are losing members and membership. Now, where it is concerned between parents and schools, or parents and teachers, a very high percentage of teachers will tell you, because I've asked, that they are teaching as well or better as they ever have, but there are fewer students who seem to be catching what is taught. And when they ask children to begin their in-class work, more than half of the kids sit and wait until the teacher goads or motivates or goes by their desk and says, would you please start? Well, the consequences for this situation are many and are varied. But one which we all have had should be worried about is that good teachers are leaving the education profession much earlier than they typically did. Many schools report that there are many teachers who have left the profession because they don't like the experience, and they leave before 5 years, and so you could take the average amount of years or years of experience of the elementary school's teachers, and you would discover that it's often 5 years or less. Now, what this means practically is that our children in the public schools are being taught by teachers who are less experienced, and if we believe that experience helps improve the quality of instruction, that it's entirely possible to get an idea about some things our children are facing. Being aware of this situation has reminded me that the foundation of our public school system is both noble and remarkable, in my opinion. And it occurred in the early days of our country that a teacher would travel, might live in the home of a prospective student, might teach a few students in that neighborhood, and then go on. And if you can imagine what that means practically, then the teacher actually knew what was going on in the family and what was happening in our schools, what to teach and how to relate to each child. So several years ago, as a consultant to our local school district, I was invited to participate in a Title IX program for early childhood education in the first 3 grades. And it was a reading program to help children who had been culturally disadvantaged and economically impoverished and so forth. That year, we began by asking the schools if they would create some additional time for the teachers of this program to go to the homes of the prospective students and visit with the parents. We gave them an interview schedule so they could ask about the children and what the children were like and what the parents wanted taught. We also asked them to ask the parents for permission to talk a little bit about the dynamics that occurred inside the family. And while that last part was not too revealing because the teacher was a stranger and so on, a lot of parents did take an opportunity to say, we have a hard time with this other child in our family. My husband and I, for example, or my wife and I are not united in our form of discipline with our children. So the teachers came away from those month-long interviews to interview every child in their classes with an idea about what the home environment was like for their prospective students. Then when they got to the school, we set up a system where the parents and the teachers would cooperate and talk about what was going on inside the school. Now, as it turned out, to begin with, all we were focused on was the social and emotional behavior of the classroom, because our teachers realized that some children come from homes where the children are not well prepared to handle a group, to handle rules, to handle order, to like a speaking or talking order, or how to start their work and or finish it, and so forth. These are basic social and emotional skills that most classrooms require, and quite often children do not come into the classroom prepared to participate well. And when they can't, of course, they often might engage in disruptive behavior because they're trying to find out what the rules are, what are the paths of success. Later on in a subsequent episode, I'm going to tell you how that evolved from the social and emotional behavior and the classroom teachers' classroom management, to actually academic, where the parents taught some learning skills in their home that the teachers also taught in the classroom. And then I'm going to tell you what happened to the students as a result of the level of unity that existed between the parents and the teachers. Okay, but back to these teachers who are teaching in kindergarten, first and second and third grades on reading improvement for these kids. Well, as it turned out, something interesting over the next year unfolded. For one thing, the parents knew the first names of the teachers, and when they would occasionally meet in a grocery store, for example, the conversation was, "Hi, Janelle," or "Hi, Ruth," or "Oh, hi," and the teacher would say Mrs. Smith or so on, but they had a friendly conversation because they knew each other. Another thing that took place is that the parents became more involved in the development and growth of the kids. So when the teacher sent home a request, "Could you bring this up with your child?" the parents had a sense of loyalty to the teachers, and the implementation of the parents at home was much higher than it was when the parents were distant and not had a strong sense of unity with the classroom teacher. More importantly, what was interesting is the teachers reported a greater commitment and investment to their work because now they knew that they were known by the parents, they knew the children, and they all began to work together. And it was sort of like a basketball team starting in the beginning of the fall year, not knowing the players and each other and the coach. And then gradually they, quote, found themselves or identified themselves what kind of a team they wanted to be, end quote. And so what happened was that this very powerful sense of influence, where the peers began to influence, the parents were invested, the teachers cooperated. And I can tell you that why the research was not rigorous, because we were just trying to test the model rather than the worry about the outcome. But I think you would find that there was significant improvement and increase in the children's rate of reading, because they would get some help at home, almost all of the kids, and then they would get some help at school as well. And then this is when one parent made this statement. She said, I've learned that when some children in a classroom do not do their work, that it might drag all of the other students backwards or down, she said, because it prevents the teacher from actually investing most of the teaching expertise that she has or he has with all of the students. Now imagine what happens to the teacher over time. One of the sort of serendipitous discoveries was this one. More of the teachers had higher morale for their teaching experience. Think of that. If we're worried about really good teachers removing themselves from the education profession because teaching is not a happy experience, then what we may have discovered is a way for teachers to feel more involved and more competent. And it's simply this. They get more support from the parents, but more importantly, the times of teaching that teachers really love, those magical moments where the kids are in tune and the teacher's in tune and they're responding and participating in this unity inside the classroom, happens more frequently. That's what the teachers indicated was more satisfying to them and why they wanted to remain in that experience if they could create it. Next year in the schools, however, I'd like to report that the administrators did not grant the teachers time to go out and visit in the students' homes, and so that practice was discontinued after 1 year. But now think about that with me, how some of the issues or problems with education, with parents and teachers and the improved performance of kids could be resolved by increased unity. And then let's suppose that some of the morale could be improved by this same method. And then let's also seem to indicate that parents invest more because they believe they can have a principal role in the achievement and success of their own children. That doesn't seem bad to me. It seems like it's a lot of very good things, all because people went to the trouble of uniting themselves in a very practical way. Now, at this point in time, you might be thinking, well, I don't have time to do that, or I don't know how we'd go about doing that. I will just say to you that doing this in a proactive form actually takes less time than the many conferences or the difficulty that you have with children who are not performing well and feeling like a failure at the time it takes for that. We can either, therefore, promote the positive unity and unifying, or we can risk the other kinds of experiences which may take place instead.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Do What Matters Most, which is sponsored by FirstAnswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Visit FirstAnswers.com to sign up for a free newsletter. Find Do What Matters Most on Facebook and our website, mattersmostmedia.org, where you can ask Dr. Scoresby your own questions. Remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the podcast app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about Do What Matters Most.